The session was scheduled for 2 days. On the morning of the second day, Louis Armstrong arrived at the studio before anyone else was in the building. He sat down in the recording booth, placed the trumpet on the stand in front of him, and did not pick it up. For 20 minutes, the engineer behind the glass watched him sitting there and said nothing. Then Ella Fitzgerald came in, walked past the outer room, came directly into the booth, and said something close to Armstrong that no one else in the building could hear. Armstrong looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached forward and picked up his trumpet. The record that followed became one of the most celebrated vocal recordings in the history of American popular music. And the story of how it came to exist says something that the music itself, however beautiful, cannot quite say on its own. By the summer of 1956, Norman Granz had been building Verve records for nearly a decade, on a principle simple to state and difficult to execute. The best jazz recordings came not from the most rehearsed musicians, but from the most capable ones, placed in genuine proximity to each other and given material they already knew. Granz believed, with the certainty of someone who had spent his adult life at the intersection of business and music, that something happened between excellent musicians in a room together that couldn't be arranged in advance. It had to emerge in the particular acoustic and human space of a session, from material that was already familiar, where the only remaining variable was what these specific people would do when they encountered each other's musical world. He had been thinking about this session for 2 years. Both Ella and Armstrong recorded for Verve. Both trusted him. The practical question had never been whether it was possible. It was what would happen in the room. Ella Fitzgerald in 1956 was the most technically accomplished vocalist in American popular music by any measure that could be applied with rigor. 3 full octaves of range, pitch that required no correction, phrasing developed over 2 decades of performing and recording into something critics were beginning to describe with the care of people noticing something they don't fully understand yet as definitive. In Ella's case, that word meant something exact. When she sang from the American Standard Songbook, the song didn't become her interpretation. It became the version the song had always been trying to be, the fullest realization of what the lyric and melody contained, delivered with a warmth and precision that made the whole transaction seem, to any listener, effortless. The effortlessness was the most difficult thing she did. It came from a discipline so complete it had made itself invisible, and from a quality of listening that musicians who recorded alongside her consistently described as the thing they were least prepared for. She didn't listen for her cue. She listened to the truth of what the other musician was doing, and then responded to that truth rather than to the surface of the performance. Armstrong at the same period occupied a more complicated position, not musically, but in how the critical culture of the era had decided to regard him. He was being discussed in 1956 as a historical artifact, the revolutionary cornetist of the 1920s Hot Five sessions, the voice that had changed what jazz could do, the name that began every serious conversation about where the music had come from. Critical assessment had placed him in the past. Armstrong himself continued touring more than 200 nights a year with his all-stars and continued playing with a physical authority and emotional directness that younger musicians encountered in person and found impossible to fully account for afterward. The quality that had made his early recordings revolutionary had not disappeared, It had concentrated. 30 years of playing had stripped away everything inessential, leaving Armstrong in his most distilled form. A musician whose relationship to a melody was so thoroughly inhabited that other musicians in the same room felt it as a kind of gravity. His phrasing found the emotional truth of a lyric not through the melodic line but around it, from angles the written note didn't require or anticipate. The ensemble Granz assembled for the sessions was small and experienced. Piano, bass, guitar, drums, calibrated to support without imposing, designed to give two large musical presences space without leaving them unmoored. The material was drawn from the standard songbook. The first day produced recordings that were, by every technical measure, excellent. The voices balanced, the takes were clean. No one made an obvious mistake. But when Grant sat with the first day's playback, he heard what he had feared from the beginning was possible. The sound of two exceptional musicians being careful with each other. Both Ella and Armstrong were performing within themselves, delivering what each was known for with full command, without quite pressing toward the boundary where their two different musical identities might produce something that neither had produced separately. What Granz understood, and what the first day confirmed, was that the carefulness between them had nothing to do with technique. Both of them had more than enough. It was something subtler, the natural instinct of two very large musical presences to make room for each other, to adjust slightly inward to avoid consuming too much of the shared space. This was, in one sense, excellent musical manners. In terms of what Granz was trying to make, it was exactly the wrong instinct. The session required not good manners, but genuine contact, a willingness to press rather than to accommodate. Armstrong arrived at the studio the following morning before the building had fully come to life. The engineer saw him come in and go directly to the booth. Armstrong placed the trumpet on the stand and sat down in front of it. He didn't review the material. He didn't warm up. He sat in the particular stillness of someone who is not resting, but waiting. Waiting for something that can be felt approaching but not named. 20 minutes passed. The engineer stayed behind the glass and said nothing. Then Ella Fitzgerald came through the main entrance. She set her coat down in the outer room and, instead of going to her microphone position, walked directly into the recording booth. She crossed to where Armstrong was sitting and stood beside him, close. She said something. The engineer could see her speaking but could not hear the words. Whatever it was brief. Armstrong looked up at her. His expression, the engineer later said, was not surprised. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing to be said and had recognized it when it arrived. Then he reached forward and picked up the trumpet. The recordings from that second morning are different from the first day's work, and the difference is audible to any careful listener. The careful quality had given way to something else, not carelessness, not abandon, but presence. The presence that comes when two musicians have decided, without discussing it, that whatever they had been holding back is no longer worth holding. Armstrong's phrasing, alongside Ella's, had found the relationship that the first day's carefulness had prevented. Not contrast, not complement, but company. His tendency to approach the emotional center of a phrase from an unexpected angle pulled against her precision in ways that created not friction, but conversation. His warmth met her clarity, and neither was diminished. What they produced in those hours was something that each of them, listening to the playback, would recognize as closer to the center of what they were trying to do than anything the previous day had reached. The full sessions produced the album Ella and Louis, released in the fall of 1956. The reviews used words like natural and inevitable, which were accurate in the sense that the record sounded, on first listen, as though it couldn't have been otherwise. What the words didn't capture was the specific shape of the decision that made it possible. The 2 days, the first day's carefulness, the 20 minutes in the booth, whatever Ella said. Natural implies effortless. What the record contained was something harder than effort. The willingness of two people who had each spent decades becoming exactly what they were, to allow the presence of the other to temporarily change the shape of what they did. Armstrong spoke about the sessions afterward in the compressed and warm terms he used for experiences he considered genuinely important. It was good, he said. Ella could really sing. Norman knew how to make a record. These were not perfunctory statements. Ella was somewhat more particular. She said that singing with Armstrong required a different kind of attention than singing with other musicians. Not more technically demanding, but qualitatively different. He was doing something with a melody, she said, that you had to be willing to follow rather than position yourself alongside. He moved through a song finding the center from unexpected directions, and to sing with him meant being willing to let that movement matter to you, to let it inform your own choices rather than simply occupying the same sonic space as yours without touching. The engineer who witnessed the second morning mentioned it once, years later, to a journalist writing about the sessions. He said he had spent time trying to reconstruct what Ella had said, had reviewed in memory the angle of her head, the brevity of whatever she spoke, Armstrong's expression when she finished. He had never arrived at an answer that satisfied him. Eventually, he stopped trying. The record existed, he reasoned, and anyone who wanted to know what Ella had said could listen to what happened immediately after. The music, he noted, was fairly clear about the general direction of things. The session was scheduled for 2 days. On the morning of the second day, Ella Fitzgerald said something to Louis Armstrong that nobody else heard, and he picked up his trumpet. What followed has been on the record for nearly 7 decades. Whatever the question was, it was exactly the right one. Whatever the answer was, it has been playing ever since, in one room after another, finding new listeners who have no idea what happened in that recording booth on a summer morning in 1956, and who, listening to what those two made together, don't need to.